Okay, it seems like it's time to start. So let me briefly introduce Dr. Lewis. Here you can see that she's the director of the Disability Services Office, and a very popular one. I've heard a lot of really great things about her, so I invited her to come and speak. And she'll take the whole class, or as much of it as she wants. And I am recording this, so if you have questions or something, I don't know, are you going to allow questions?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so just speak up, okay?
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's so wonderful to be in a room full of people. I'm usually so much more in one-on-one spaces with folks. What a rare privilege. I'm a little low down. I can't see many of your faces, but hi to those of you I haven't met. My name's Catherine Lewis. I am director in the Disability Services Office, or DSO for short, here at RIT. My sign name is Catherine, a C bouncing down the side of my face, and I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks for the time. So what I want to do today is sort of start with a general overview of disability and access from somewhat of a different perspective than you may have encountered before. And then your professor asked me to dig into some of my own personal narratives and experiences as a proud disabled woman who has lived accessibility as a primary factor throughout her life. So we can get personal. There's no need to walk on eggshells, but really, as you're thinking about usability and design and your careers and what access means in that scope, I'm going to invite a lot of dialogue and questions. But to get the ball rolling, let me walk through a couple things. First, ableism is this nasty thing that exists in the world, which is a presumption, a false presumption that there's a binary between able-bodiedness and disability identity, and one is better than the other. That mindset results in the oppression of disabled folks and the presumption that that experience is somehow less than or less valuable than folks without disabilities. And so what I'd like to ask you to do, a bit of a thought experiment with me today, is if we can disregard this notion of disability as less than and go somewhere else, okay? So the first question I want to ask y'all to ponder, where is the problem of disability? Problem in air quotes on purpose. Is the problem in Catherine Lewis and her atypical gait, who runs on a regular basis into accessibility barriers because of the environment around her? Is it a thing that I need to fix about myself? Or is it a problem in the environment? Is it something that we all share a collective responsibility to engage with and critique? On that note, there's two models of disability that I want to share with you. The first is called the medical model of disability. Has anybody encountered this before? Is this familiar? I see a couple head nods, hand raises, yeah. So in the spirit of access, there's an image on the screen. And I wonder if anybody would be willing to take a shot at describing the image or what you notice about it, specifically the figure here. How would you describe what's going on? Go for it.
Could you maybe help us read some of the stuff I can?
Don't worry about the text,
Okay.
actually. Just focus.
Just like the person?
Yeah, on
Okay.
the dude in the middle here, wearing the shirt that says the problem. At the top it says the individual, and then problem, problem, problem. So what are you noticing?
Okay.
Go for it. Give it a shot.
I see like a lot of outside factors telling the one person that the problem they're very sad. They
Yeah.
don't really have like a regular or happy expression. It's them not looking great about themselves.
What direction are the arrows pointing?
In toward the person.
Yeah. So the message is that the problem, again in air quotes, of disability is a personal individual one that needs to be fixed, cured, eliminated whenever possible. Of course, that's the solution. That's ableism. That's what the medical model tells us. Let's toss that out the window for the moment and try a different way of framing it. Anybody want to take a shot at describing the difference between the first figure we just talked through and the one on the screen now? Yeah.
That the person is able to, not able, but the person is describing the world around them as presenting barriers to them, and thus that the problem is not within themselves.
Yeah, the direction of the arrows goes
Right.
outward toward the environment around the person. And the problem is not individual, the problem is barriers, whether physical, attitudinal, structural, educational, whatever it might be. That's the social model of disability. And I think that this approach is a pretty hopeful one, right? It says the way we can improve as a community is to learn to notice those barriers, how they manifest for different people in this world, and how we can collectively start to knock them down. You with me so far? Yeah, awesome. Thank you for the head nod. Seeing the tops of your heads back there. Okay, so now the next thing I'd like to do for just a couple minutes is introduce you to some people. And I'll just speak personally for a second. I think sometimes when folks think about disability, we think about it as this other thing off in the corner that, you know, phew, thank goodness that's not me, or that's just a small population of folks that have to deal with some tough stuff, right? Let's think about disability today as a people thing, as a human thing, as simply a facet of human identity. And with that in mind, rather than talking just about the functionality of a specific disability, like my own, for example, I want to introduce you to some different folks and their perspectives on this lived experience, okay? So the first is an incredible choreographer and poet and artist whose name is Neil Marcus. There's an image on the side of the screen depicting Neil holding a cerulean blue frame around his face. The frame's sort of tilted to the side, and Neil's face is in the center of the frame. He's got this sort of impish grin on his face, and there's a quote on the screen which says, "Disability is not a, quote, brave struggle or courage in the face of adversity. Disability is an art. It's an ingenious way to live." So let that sink in for a minute. That's not this dominant, knee-jerk reaction of disability equals deficit. This is disability as a fund of knowledge, disability as something that can allow us to be more creative, more ingenious, more thoughtful about the way we engage. And I love Neil's perspective on that. By the way, I'm going to share a strategy that I've been employing and you've been employing since we started talking. You notice I'm reading aloud the things on the slides, describing the images we see. That's an important strategy. The presumption, I won't insult your intelligence by reading aloud what's on the slide, presumes that we all engage with information in the same way. Not true, right? So bear that in mind as one concrete takeaway, whether you're teaching, working with others. Don't presume that we all engage in the same way with the information on a screen. Cool? All right, somebody else I want you to know. Haben Gurman. Has anybody encountered Haben? Yeah? Haben, by the way, is likely coming to campus in September. We're working on planning a visit for her. She is a fierce civil rights and disability rights attorney who happens to be the first deaf-blind woman to have graduated from Harvard Law. Her autobiography recently came out, and it's just titled her first name, Haben. I really recommend reading it. But Haben, who's depicted on the screen wearing a red dress, presenting a keynote, is holding her communication device. She communicates through an electronic braille display, which feeds her the information that's being presented verbally or through sign through her device in braille. She often demonstrates that just to sort of illustrate how she communicates with folks. There's also a quote on the screen from Haben, which says, "Disability is an opportunity for innovation." Is there anything more RIT? I think this is a really powerful way to think about things, and in the spirit of usability and design, bear that in mind. All right, couple more, and I'll be brief because I want to really dialogue with y'all. But LeRoy Moore is a pretty cool dude. We met, by the way, in the Rochester airport once. I was in my mobility scooter just scooting along, and he was in his, and he doesn't know me. I didn't, but I knew him from his work with Crip Hop Nation. My doctorate happens to be in classical music. I was, for a long time, a flutist, and I did a lot of work in disability arts, and LeRoy Moore is a force in that space, and so I recognized his face and went, "Oh my God, are you LeRoy Moore?" And we had this chat in the Rochester airport just a few months ago. But anyway, LeRoy Moore is one of the founders, hi, welcome, of the disability justice movement. And beyond this binary of medical model versus social model that we've been talking about, LeRoy insists that we take an intersectional look at disability. We are more than single issue people. To be a person of color who identifies as disabled in this world is a very different lived experience than a white woman who is living disability. And we have to acknowledge all the parts of our identity and what they bring to our experience. That's one of the tenets of the disability justice movement. There's a quote on the screen that I will read that I think is really powerful. Under the quote, there's this image of LeRoy, a black man who's holding his hands in front of him in this really sort of powerful gesture. And he says, all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies are whole. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. We move together, no body left behind. This is disability justice. So really what gets to my core about this perspective from Mr. Moore is because of, not in spite of. Right? It's ableism that's pushing us to presume that we succeed, that we thrive, that we deserve access in spite of our disability identities. Let it be something that matters. Let it be something of value, and I think that's what LeRoy brings. Lastly, in terms of introducing you to some folks, this is Mia Mingus. Mia's depicted on the screen here wearing a black t-shirt with a logo on the front, which is one of my favorite in the world. It's this sort of floral picture, and it says ableism is trash. I happen to have a mug that has that very logo on it in my office. Sometimes our interpreters might have seen me do this. If I'm feeling particularly snarky and there's some ableist stuff going on, I slowly lift up my mug. But anyway, I love that, and those are Mia's words. One of the things that I think in terms of design and accessibility that Mia shared, you want to do a switch? Oh, okay, thanks. Is access is not a compliance mechanism. Access is not a federal obligation per the ADA. Access is something we do in the service of love and community and justice. Because we all matter, because our experiences matter. In other words, to sum Mia's perspective up, the law is the floor, not the ceiling. And when you think about design and accessibility, sure, familiarize yourself with web content accessibility guidelines. Familiarize yourself with the ADA and regulations as far as what makes a space technically accessible. But go beyond that and base your work on lived experience. Okay? Now last, before I open things up, I want to talk a little bit about language and symbols and identity, because it's one of the questions I get most often. As you're working with folks and you're embedding accessibility into the work you do, I'm going to invite you to dialogue with folks who live the experience that you're trying to workshop. When doing that, you're going to want to be thoughtful about language. You probably have encountered this binary between person first and identity first language. If you want to raise your hand if that's familiar to you. Yeah, okay. So person first language is, Catherine is a woman with a disability. And I'm intentionally in that semantic structure putting person with a disability before the word disability to privilege personhood over disability experience. For a long time, that was perceived as the more respectful way to frame disability. There's a critique of that happening right now, and within the disability community, more and more folks are shifting language a little bit toward identity first, which would be, Catherine is a disabled woman. I'm not here to tell you that one or the other is right or wrong. Cultural humility matters. However folks refer to themselves is the way we should refer to them. I've undergone my own evolution over time with regard to this. When I was a college student, I was adamantly person first. And as I built more disability community around myself and thought more about what that identity meant, I really intentionally identify as a capital D disabled woman. So anyway, not here to tell you that's right or wrong, but to make you aware of both of those perspectives. A couple other things to be aware of that I can say with a little more concreteness. First, impairment-rooted language. Catherine is wheelchair-bound. Mobility devices don't bind us or restrict us. They give us the freedom and the ability to engage in the world. Avoid that language. Somebody is hearing impaired. Deaf gain, not hearing loss. avoid impairment-rooted language in favor of deaf or hard of hearing. Additionally, avoid presuming that disability is a tragedy or that somebody doesn't want to be identified with disability community. I'm so sorry. Nah, no need for it. Things must be so difficult for you. Set it aside. That's ableism talking. But also, language like special needs, differently abled. Have you heard that? My 2 cents. There was this YouTube video that went around. There was this woman with Down syndrome who was talking about her perspective on the framing special needs. Has anybody seen that? It's kind of old, so it's maybe not so fresh anymore, but it was pretty funny. Her point essentially was, my needs aren't special. My needs are just needs. And she said, if I needed a dinosaur egg for my breakfast, that would be special. I simply need the access supports to engage in the world. Nothing special about it, right? So special needs tends to be considered euphemistic and somewhat offensive to many, not all. I'll also suggest that disability in and of itself is not a bad word. You can say it and say it pridefully. I would recommend avoiding differently abled unless somebody explicitly asks you to use that terminology toward them. Cool? And lastly, symbols. Do you see right behind our interpreter friend here 2 images, one of an older accessibility icon and one of a differently shaped icon? Anybody in the mood to describe the first one, the one on the left? Go for it.
A person is depicted in what I assume to be is meant to be a wheelchair with thin lines in profile from the side, with legs dangling out and forward over the wheel, and arms out at a 90-degree angle from their body.
Nicely done. That's a great example of image description. So, to extrapolate from that description, the person's not driving themselves. Their hands are out in front of them and not on the wheels of their chair. They're sort of static, unmoving. There's no sort of line markers in the wheels indicating motion. So does anybody want to take a shot at describing the second image, the one to the right?
So the second one has a much, has a person with a much like thicker look to them, more similar to like other like symbols that use people. There's more symbolism suggesting motion, like the wheels, the lines going through the wheels are diagonal, not horizontal or vertical, which looks like it's a wheel movement. And he has an arm behind his back, sort of like he just used it to push his wheels to get these movements.
Yeah, beautiful.
And he's a little leaning forward when he's trying to get his signal.
There you go. You're one of the first folks that's caught on to the more human depiction of the body itself, sort of thicker, more human-like than just a stick. I really like that, and I also appreciate the points you've made about momentum, initiated by self, not by other. Yeah? So this is really the point behind the shift from the old international symbol of accessibility to the new accessible icon. For what it's worth, in 2013, New York State became the first state to mandate use of that icon on all new signage, and in that same legislation, eliminate the use of the word handicap from any state laws and documents. Cool?
So ours must be old because our parking lot has the word handicap on it, and I often wondered about that.
Yes, you're right. The accessible parking would be a better framing than handicap parking. And over time, hopefully, we'll phase out some of those older signs. Yeah, so change takes time, but this is the direction we're headed. Cool? What's up?
So also about the word handicap, this hasn't been covered here. I can sort of infer from this that it's used for people, not preferable. Is this like extended to applications beyond referring to like somebody having a disability, like say, oh, this person's not good at this game, I will give them 5 points to start with as a handicap? Would that also not
That's
be?
a really interesting question. Yeah. I I would suggest that we can limit our avoidance of the term to when we're referring to disability specifically. Yeah, like I'm not a sports person, but in golf, right, a handicap is a thing, right?
Right.
Yeah, fine. Just as long as you're not referring to disability when you say the word, I think you're okay. Cool. Okay, so all of that is pretty general stuff, overview stuff, framing stuff that I wanted to start off with to sort of set the tone. But I'm also happy now to dive into some personal experience, to answer questions, to think about things. But I wonder if I could ask you all to tell me a little bit more about, over the course of this semester, you're in the home stretch. What have you been learning? How is this applying to the careers you see yourselves moving down? Does this seem relevant at all? What's on your minds?
Having a bunch of speakers, you come in, the other speaker guy come in, and just the things that professors talk to us about really opened my eyes to all the different ways we could change and innovate, all of our different products that we make. I never thought about, I knew about color blindness or text to speech before, but I never knew how to implement them, or other things and apps like the Be My Eyes app, another speaker told us about, that could be super helpful. So currently in the curriculum, it's done a good job of showing us all the different, it's not a binary of one person can't walk and the other can. It's so many different things that we can do to make our products that we're gonna make now and in the future so much more accessible to such a wider audience.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know about half the stuff that I could do to fix and update a bunch of my websites to be more accessible
Yeah.
to other people.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Anybody else have any thoughts? So I can share some stuff, and let me know if any questions come up. But the reason I started with sort of this general framing, one of the most important recommendations I'll make, you've learned about human-centered design and sort of focusing your work on the experience of real living people and their interaction with whatever it is that you're building. Do that. There is no formula for accessibility. For example, in my office, in the Disability Services office, it's not as though we have this magical formula sheet that says, Catherine, as a woman who has cerebral palsy as her diagnosis, is eligible for the following 6 things. Or if you have ADHD, here are the 3 things that you will benefit from. It's interactive, it's student-centered, it's individualized. It's based on your context, your environment. Same goes for whatever it is that you're doing. There is no encyclopedia that will give you the answers to universal accessible design. You have to listen to the folks around you. And the skill that I think we need to hone when we talk about accessibility is noticing. So when my husband and I were looking for our first home 6 or 7 years ago now, first of all, when we had our first meeting with a mortgage broker, I remember and this is both internalized and external ableism talking. I didn't bring my walker with me. I had a cane that I kept in my purse. I got to the meeting and I sat down and made sure I was there early enough that the mortgage banker walked in after I did. It was a symptom of knowing how many times disabled folks have been denied mortgages, the oppression that marginalized communities face when they're pursuing access to homes and loans and things like this. My fear around that was so strong that I performed a different identity than my own. Ugh, right? Then, when we began working with a realtor, I can't tell you how many times I would explain my needs. As, by the way, a person with rather modular mobility, I brought my walker on purpose today because I want to talk to you about some stuff related to parenting and equipment design. But I often use a scooter on campus. If I'm in a certain setting where I can't, I have a cane that I use, but I flex depending on the environment that I'm in. The realtor that I work with would say, oh, it's just 1 step into the building. Just 1 step. And I went, right, 1 step is equivalent to 15 steps. I don't care. A step is a step is a step. I need a home without a step. right? Or there's no step into the home, but as soon as we enter, there's like a stairway up to the main floor and a stairway down to the lower floor. Oh, common sense stuff, right? The width of doors, navigating space, all this stuff. But yeah, so just, in the spirit of sharing some examples. One of the most formative experiences I have had working with students around accessibility and accessible design was when I was pregnant. I have a 3-year-old son, his name is Elliot. He'd be running around here asking you all about your computers and talking about dinosaurs if you were here. When I was pregnant, I was trying to figure out how the heck I was gonna navigate my body, my mobility, and my newborn. And a lot of the strategies out there that exist are centered around parents who use wheelchairs. So there are some really cool devices that strap a baby to you, keep your baby close to your lap, or have adapted sort of attachments that go in front of your chair, so when you're pushing, your baby is right there. None of those would work around the house. In my house, I use a walker, and I did when I was pregnant. And I needed to be able to stand and carry my baby safely without the use of my hands, because as you can see, they're occupied. This doesn't work. I'm going to tip over, right? And I really need to lean if that starts to get wobbly, right? So I need to figure out design that doesn't involve my hands and allows me to carry my kid safely. So at the time, I was working at University of Rochester, and a team of biomedical engineering seniors took on my conundrum as their senior design project. And what they did is they designed, first of all, they found the lightest car seat out there. It was 5 pounds only, because weight throws off my balance. And if you think about even a 10 or 15 pound newborn in a 8 or 9 pound car seat, that's a heck of a thing, right? So they found this really light car seat and built these attachments that connected to the front of my walker and the back. Here, I'll come back and show you what I mean. They took the seat off, and there was an attachment here and here, and then a buckle under the bottom to double ensure that the seat would stay. And I would latch this car seat into my walker, and there was a back bar here, just like there is now, to make sure that it didn't move, right? So I felt safe. I felt like my kiddo wasn't gonna go flying, but I could also carry him hands-free. That's what I did to get him, diaper explosion and all, from our bedroom to his changing table, right? That's how I navigated parenting, was with an adaptive device. Then we had to figure out how I was gonna get that into the car safely. You should see the series of railings and adaptive gear getting me from the door to my house to my car. It's a heck of a journey. So having a creative mindset, a problem-solving mindset, and recognizing that it's never one size fits all, I think is really one of the most important things. So I recognize I'm talking a lot at you. Are things hitting in an interesting place? Do you have any questions or any specific things you want to talk about?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I often use my phone while I'm walking, and I'm wondering if you ever do that, and if so, do you need adaptive technology for that?
It's a good question. I don't phone when I have my walker. If I need to send a text, I'll pause to break on text and then keep going. But ever since I was in college, I'm a multitasker at heart, and so whenever I'm in my scooter, I'm always making a call to get something done. So when I'm scooting, I can activate my scooter with just one hand, and I tend to phone. But folks with Bluetooth headsets can accomplish the same thing. I don't happen to have one myself, but I see a head nod. Is that how you tend to navigate?
Partially, yeah.
Yeah. So I think technology's given us a lot of different options. Wireless technology, earbuds, we don't need to hold the thing to access the thing anymore, which is pretty cool. What else is on your mind? Bless you. Yeah.
I know my grandparents or great-grandparents' house, it's been a really long time, to get down to their basement, they had like one of those like chairs that sits at the top of the stairs.
Oh, yeah.
You sit down in it and you push.
Yep.
Are those still like the main way to like get up and down like full flights of stairs in a house?
Yeah, most of the time, yeah. Most folks who, let me make some generalizations, acknowledging that they're generalizations. Aging in place is a big trend, right? As folks get older, all of us at some point are going to engage with disability in some way. That's the nature of the human experience, right? And so a lot of times folks who may have lived in their home for quite a long time will try and figure out a way to adapt it and use those chair lifts as a way to make the staircase accessible. I know some folks that, keep a walker on the top floor and a walker in the basement and use the chairlift to get between. But generally speaking, if you're a mobility device user who is looking at an environment through that lens at the outset, you're going to want to find a place that allows you to navigate space without that chairlift, because you're going to need to figure out how to be safe on that chairlift and also have the gear you need once you get to either place. That make sense? Yeah, but they're real functional if that's what you need. If it's the stairs themselves, plain and simple, that are the problem, the action of climbing up and down stairs, beautiful. They're pretty expensive.
Imagine.
Yeah. What else? Any questions about the online space?
Yeah. So I'm curious both about your specific disability and more generally how people with cerebral palsy have interactions with computers and phones and things like that.
Yeah, that's a big question. First of all, my particular disability is really, really broad and can manifest in a lot of different ways. So I would not consider me representative of that lived experience fully. For some, with certain manifestations of disability, assistive technology like text-to-speech, being able to listen to what's on the screen, or vice versa, speech-to-text dictation can really be useful. Sticky keys and quick tools to help you navigate without certain physical or motor movements can be really useful. For me, I haven't navigated those particular access barriers myself, but what I will say from a motor standpoint, I mentioned, so my doctorate's in flute performance. I went to the Eastman School and spent a long time as a flutist, and this finger, this pinky, we are arch nemeses. In the world of what they call small muscle athletics as a classical flutist, the way my finger moves is nothing that a medical provider would ever look at it and say, oh, I see. But the twitch motion, the really fast movement that you need to do to play, is a different level of precision. And until I got into my doctoral program, I found ways around this finger's fallibility in terms of its speed. And it was never once suggested to me that I could make my tool, my flute, more accessible. Just find your way around, Catherine. Practice. Spend probably a cumulative month of your life, if anyone's an instrumentalist, going da 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 da, and trying to do something to make this finger be what it's not, right? It's not going to work because this is integral to my body. It's not a skill that I can develop and then change how this finger works necessarily. It will always be what it is. The vulnerability it took within the rather hostile environment of classical music to acknowledge an access barrier and work toward a modification was huge. I had to establish enough credibility in the field, having gotten into a doc program at a really well-regarded music school, before I even said to someone, I need to work on getting this problem solved. My tool is not working for me. That doesn't happen for young instrumentalists. There's a one-handed woodwind department that's still new at University of Nebraska Kearney that was started because their saxophone professor had a stroke and lost the use of the left side of his body. So saxophone, 2 hands to get the full range of the instrument, right? what an instrument tech developed for him was a toggle key mechanism with 3 columns. So the outer column does the work of this hand. The inner middle column does the work of the other hand. And then the innermost column does what you would do if you were using both hands. And so you get the full range of the saxophone with a 3-column, one-handed system. That was done for someone with tenure who'd been a saxophone professor for 20 years. They took that prototype and built a department. And for the first time, a Rochesterian actually, whose parent went to and taught at RIT, was the recipient of the prototype one-handed saxophone. She'd lost her arm in a skiing accident and wanted to play. So now the door is open finally for folks with different bodily setups to play 2-handed instruments. But gosh, the thought that the question wasn't even raised, how can we adapt your tool, shows, I think, the lack of creative thinking in terms of mitigating barriers. So online space, back to your question, it all depends on your physical setup. There are so many ways to navigate technology. For me, I'm pretty standard in that regard, but there are colleagues that I work with who share my same diagnosis, for example, who have a very different lived experience of it and use different strategies to navigate online. Somebody brought up color. Color, contrast online, adaptability of the size of content, clear and consistent formatting. All of these things help, not just from the standpoint of readability and plain language, which, by the way, is an accessibility strategy, but also, are you familiar with screen readers? Yeah? Awesome. So when you clearly organize and structure content online, screen readers can better understand what's happening on the page rather than just offering this giant block of text to someone who's getting content read to them via that technology. So in terms of online strategies, I think those are really important ones.
I'm curious if you ever got a solution to the flute.
Sure did. I didn't finish that story, did I? So I worked with the same tech. His name is Jeff Stelling, who designed that toggle system saxophone. And I said, all right, Jeff, this finger, I got to do the work of this spatula, A flat key with some other part of my body. And he developed, does anybody play flute? Yeah? So has anybody ever laid their hands on a flute? Even if you don't consider yourself still to play? Yeah, I see a hand. So in the right hand of a flute, you have a key for each of these 3 fingers and then also trill keys in between. What we ended up doing was building an additional trill key that operated the G sharp or A flat key with a trill key that my right hand could use, index finger. And I remember the first time that I effectively rapidly trilled between G and A flat, like da 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 da, without this finger with that trill key, and I sat in a practice room at the Eastman School and sobbed. Truly, oh my God, finally! Because the act of, this is ableism again, talking, the act of reaching my right hand over to activate that key was considered taboo. Don't do that. That's not how you play. That's not how you do it. So to find a mechanism that even presented as more normative was more palatable than figuring out a different way to play. So yeah, eventually I got a key built that allowed me to navigate my flute differently. I remember that my professors were reticent to even touch my flute after it was modified. Folks said to me things, I don't know how to play that instrument. I'm sure you'll figure it out, Catherine, you're really creative. But there's so much fear toward adapting and being vulnerable. We gotta get rid of that nonsense. To be vulnerable and to experiment and to fail does not mean you're not expert at what you're doing. So please don't be afraid of that. Yeah, so we did find a solution, but it was an interesting road and was actually the catalyst, the upset, the anger, the fury, really, that I felt at the inaccessibility of classical music education in the higher ed setting was what led me to do this work. I came to the conclusion I always and forever was going to be a flute faculty member. That was my path. But I couldn't join a system that was so hostile toward folks and bodies like mine until I knew how to solve it. And then I went back to school to study higher ed and grappled with this question of who feels like they belong in a space like this and who doesn't, and how we can fix that. And here we are, right? But yeah, it's been an interesting journey getting there.
It's great that you chose this path because you've made a big difference at RIT from what I've heard from disabled students.
Thank you. Thank you. We have work to do still, but I really appreciate that. And what I will say, I mean, back to this idea that there's no encyclopedia of access, that there's no like recipe for good accessible design that will work for everyone. We have to stay humble. We have to stay receptive to what people offer us. And so for me, the most important value is listening and welcoming feedback. There are things that exist on this campus that still present barriers to myself and others every single day. It's okay to share that, to push on that, and to work together to solve it. I don't have all the answers. I don't know at this moment how to fix all the barriers that exist, but our first job is to find them and to point them out and to use the innovation that is just like brimming in this community to solve them together. And absolutely there are financial and structural and procedural barriers to all of this, but we'll get it done. So really that's maybe the most important thing to me is this openness to dialogue about it, because no one person will have all the answers to accessible design. We have to bear that collective commitment and workshopping together.
I have maybe a difficult question. What about hostility?
Yeah, give me an example of what you're thinking about.
Well, there are faculty members I know who say that disability rights interferes with fairness, for example.
Ooh. Wait, it raises the hairs on the back of my neck. That's ableism talking. And I will be blunt and frank with you. With deep respect for my colleagues, we all have learning to do, myself included. But each of us engages in this world differently. There is nothing inequitable about having the tools you need to do what you're here to do. Equity is not unfair. An accommodation, by definition, in the Americans with Disabilities Act can be considered unreasonable in a few contexts. One, you have to be otherwise qualified to be here. Every single student who has an accommodation with my office is an RIT student, plain and simple, who is here on their own merit. One. Two, an accommodation can't present a direct threat to the safety of self or others. So that's why masking's been complicated, right? For a lot of folks. For deaf and hard of hearing colleagues who may rely on lip reading, having to cover your face has been a huge access barrier. For neurodiverse folks and others with sensory sensitivities, having this sucker on your face when you're trying to take a 3-hour high-stakes exam, get out of here, right? So there are absolutely barriers that mask wearing presents, but we ultimately determined that it would be a direct threat to the safety of the community to allow an outright exemption from the mask requirement. So we figured out different ways to accommodate. For example, come take your tests in the DSO in a private room where you can take that mask off and breathe, things like this. But an accommodation can't pose a direct threat to safety is another parameter. An accommodation can't pose what's called an undue burden. Bear in mind that that's in relation not just to the DSO's budget, but to RIT. So undue burden is a really high bar. It can be administrative as well. If you let your faculty know about a complex accommodation with 24 hours notice, for example, they might not reasonably be able to make it happen for you. So communication is really important. But lastly, and most importantly to your question, an accommodation per the law cannot pose what's called a fundamental alteration to the activity that you're doing. So, we had a lot of students at the outset of COVID who found themselves facing access barriers because their level of risk was really high. Maybe they had one of those high-risk CDC-identified health conditions that made them feel like being in a communal space like this was just too much of an access barrier to their well-being. Maybe it was mental health. Maybe folks were facing access barriers so significant related to being in a communal space during the height of COVID that it was an appropriate accommodation for them to be virtual. if you are in a hands-on biology lab, for example, or a ceramics class or studio art class over at CAD, that very accommodation may be what's called a fundamental alteration to what you're there to do. That renders it unreasonable, so we gotta figure out other ways, maybe delaying the course till it's safer or whatever it might be. But in sum, to the point about accommodations somehow diluting the rigor of what folks are here to do, that's my very job, is to make sure that we're not fundamentally altering what an RIT degree is all about. In fact, I would be in non-compliance with the law if any accommodation I provided did that. So this narrative of accommodations as unfair advantage, am I allowed to swear?
You can say what you will.
It's absolute bullshit, with love. But that doesn't mean that all accommodations are appropriate in all settings. And we must partner with faculty and students to figure out when a problem arises, how to work around it. So I'm looking at things from the 30,000-foot view, right? And thinking about what a student might need in a variety of settings. They might run into a specific class or activity here where that's not gonna work. Faculty have every right to say, DSO, what's up with that? That's not gonna function in this space. And we need to consult and solve and work around it. But to say that outright use of accommodations is unfair, inequitable, diluting the rigor of an RIT degree, that's ableism talking. Again, said with deep respect and appreciation for the learning that we all have to do as a community, but 2 cents.
So I'm not sure that that question was, maybe I didn't phrase it right. You responded with logic and knowledge to it, and what I'm really talking about when I speak of hostility is people who are emotional in their, when they want, for example, you know, and I am thinking of faculty because that's what I am, and I know faculty members who have emotional objections to disability rights, but they're not necessarily grounded in fact or logic. They're more grounded in feelings.
Sure. So I was intentional in how I framed the conversation today, starting with people, introducing you to some people. I think that's what some folks who feel that hostility, or I would argue perhaps it's fear, are experiencing, a lack of understanding that we're talking about people here. And the more we base our education of this community in human narrative, student perspective, faculty and staff perspective about what access means and what it does, the more we'll break down that attitudinal barrier. But again, we need to be a campus that shares a collective commitment to continuous learning and improvement. If you feel in your core that there's something wrong with accessibility, I would encourage you to reach out to my office and have a conversation, because there's some learning that needs to be done. I would encourage you to connect with people, read, learn from folks like Gurman, Neil Marcus, Mia Mingus, who can tell you about their lived experience and help knock down some of these presumptions about access as somehow taking away the rights of others or the quality of an experience. We've got to base it in humanity and remember that we're talking about community. And by the way, disability is one of the only identity groups that any one of us can join at a moment's notice. This is not this sort of other thing that we can ignore and pretend doesn't apply. So we gotta grapple with it. We gotta engage with it, and we gotta think about it. And I think the folks that feel that hostility are ones that haven't done that work yet. And I would welcome a cup of coffee and a very receptive and thoughtful and not angry, I promise, conversation with any of those faculty.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. We're out of time now. And the next class is going to be coming in here any minute. But I want to thank you very much for the great talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, guys. You can find me if you want to send an email, Catherine Lewis in Global, CBLDSO. But anytime anybody wants to talk about this stuff, stop on by or send me a note, okay? Thanks for the time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.